Oh, there it is. Okay. New video. He probably hasn't done this before, but at least it's wow. Okay.
Just to let you know, I put a black screen up.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So, because I'm live now.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah. And I turned on audio.
Oh my gosh. How are you doing today, sir?
Good, thanks.
Nice to see you.
Good to see you.
So I kind of switched it up a bit, and I just put name tags wherever. You're welcome to move yours if no one
I
has.
don't care.
The only thing is I put Elaine's binder here because she wasn't here earlier, the last meeting. So please have a seat wherever you'd like.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Richard, how are you? Fine. Good. Good. Oh, never. You don't want me to lie right away, do you? No, we'll wait for you. Yeah. Give me a little time to get warmed up. So are you
Just come up. Can I trade the swaps with you then? Yeah, you or you can. Mark is
So did you get my email a few minutes ago?
Yeah.
Good afternoon. Is this loud? Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Mark Prestwich. I'm your facilitator today for your February 12th, 2020 St. Helena Financing Civic Infrastructure Task Force meeting. And at this time, we'll have the clerk with roll call.
Member David?
Here.
Member Hale?
Here.
Member Honig?
Here.
Member Keneally? Member McBroom?
Here.
Member Wallach?
Here.
Member Ward?
Here.
Item 3 on our agenda is public comment pertaining to the Civic Infrastructure Task Force. And I'll pause to see if there is any public comment. There is none. Item 4 on your agenda can be taken care of now, or we can postpone that to later in the meeting. Is there a preference with the members of the committee?
I'm new to this, so what's the
So use your,
protocol?
it would
I
be,
can raise my hand or speak up. I think it'd be worth waiting a bit on that so we can work together a little bit. I don't know. So we don't have to, I feel like I'm being asked to marry someone on the first date. I kind of, can we?
Second.
Same.
okay. So what we can do is reorder the agenda, and we will consider that perhaps after the discussion items. So we're going to start with a status report on City Hall, the library, streetscape projects, storm drains, and other general fund obligations. And we're going to load a brief PowerPoint. And in front of you, there is a handout that we'll work from initially. It's a spreadsheet that is titled Status of General Fund Projects and Cost Estimates. So if you go to the second slide. So these are really the assets that the council is asking the task force to focus on, and these are general fund assets. And we're going to walk through this spreadsheet that I didn't include up here. But if I can direct your attention to the spreadsheet, this is a summary of each of these projects and an overview of either the current status and options that the council has refined, along with current cost estimates and information related to whether they're currently funded or unfunded. So with City Hall, the council has, through the course of the last several months and work with Noel and Tam, narrowed the focus for City Hall to 2 locations and 2 options. One is a single-story 8,500 square foot City Hall that would be essentially adjacent to the library. This cost estimate that we have here includes a approximately 2,500 square foot replacement Stevenson Museum that would be included in that building. So just know that the cost estimate is driven from a slightly larger building because the version that we were looking at included replacing the building, having the new building placed in a way that would disrupt the existing Stevenson Museum. The cost estimate for this can really be applied to other locations, but the council has not opened the door to other locations. They've closed the door on other locations. Doesn't mean that they've made a final decision on this. It can change, but for purposes of this conversation, this cost estimate should serve as a way of knowing what a single-story, single-hall building of approximately 8,500 square feet would look like. Option B, which is under development now, is a combination City Hall library that would be placed on the library parcel. And so we would the concept would be to take down the existing library and build a single building that contains both City Hall and the library and take advantage of the synergies that occur with a single roof, a single staircase, a single elevator, shared meeting rooms, etc. That cost estimate is going to be significant. When I looked at there was a combination alternative that we looked at for all new buildings, and I believe that number was in the $45 million range when we looked at that building being constructed in a couple of years, a little bit of escalation along with the additional 30% in soft costs. So this number is going to be fairly significant. It will probably approach that number or be close to it. It's too early to tell you what that number is. And when we receive it in a couple of weeks, we will share it with you. And I believe we are scheduling a council presentation on March 10th, right? So we're anticipating sharing the work that Noel and Tam is working on today with the council on March 10th, with the idea that we would come back to you on March 11th with the same information. And we generally publish the council reports about 10 days in advance of council meetings, so you can know that it will be available a little earlier than that. In terms of the library, there are really three options for the library that we're thinking about today. Option one is replacement of the roof only. So we initially budgeted $380,000 in the current year budget. We went to bid on that roof. We realized that there is about $150,000 of asbestos removal that comes with the replacement of that roof that increased the cost. And given the consideration of taking down the library as an option, the council decided to bifurcate that roofing project and has proceeded with replacement of a flat portion of the roof, which is about a $200,000 project. It's actually being replaced as we speak and should be done in the next week or two. But they've postponed the replacement of the pitched portion of the roof, which is very expensive. But we have now, with some one-time monies, we have allocated $630,000. We were looking at this number earlier today. We believe we have most of the resources that we would need when we go to bid, if we were to go to bid to replace the roof. But that decision is being postponed to the conclusion of some of this work. Option two that was studied included a comprehensive remodel and an expansion of the library. So this would require the removal of the staff, maybe a possible phasing within the building, but a comprehensive remodel where the HVAC is replaced, the building is open to the rear and the vineyard views. There's probably engagement at that back of the building and outside programming that becomes available. Addition of a 60-room classroom for programming purposes. Replacement and update of all of the inside of the building. And if you've taken a look and walked through a modern library today, they're pretty different. They're different, and they're interesting buildings to take a look at. It would include replacement of the bathrooms as well. And there was not an analysis done of a modest somewhere between a roof replacement and a comprehensive remodel. So certainly smaller type projects can be done and can substantially reduce that number if we the city wanted and the community wanted something of a more modest investment on that building beyond a roof. And if we invest in the roof replacement this summer, for example, all of it, you would discount that from the $15 million figure that you see here for the comprehensive remodel, along with essentially the $200,000 that we've committed today. So the $600,000 is funded, the $15 million is not. And option three for the library, I think of the library as small, medium, and large, right? The roof is small, the comprehensive remodel is a heavy medium, and replacement of the building is large, and that's the number that's to be determined, and that's the same as what we will find on option B above under the City Hall. Let me stop there and see if you have questions about these numbers. These have not been escalated, but they do include the soft costs that have been provided to the city.
So, Mark, the decision that the City Council is going to make on this, is that dependent in any way on the work this task force is doing in terms of the ability to pay for this work, or is the decision going to be made on other grounds?
I think the council is looking for the task force to provide recommendations on how to fund or finance, phase the projects. So, for example, the roof does need to be, it's required now. If we're going to continue to operate that building, we need to fix the roof relatively soon. The comprehensive remodel and expansion, that certainly can be postponed. It could be postponed indefinitely. And in terms of a replacement building, again, if we have a solid roof, that's a project that can be postponed indefinitely. The library board has written a nice letter to the council that explains that they're comfortable with either approach, which is a very good place to be because there's, I think, willingness and flexibility to consider different options. But the ability to pay will have to be, and fund will have to be a consideration that may influence the sequencing or delivery of projects.
Question? It sounds good to defer work. However, we're really accruing a future liability. Construction costs have not gone down in any recent times, and clearly, if this is spread out over too long a period, it's going to cost a lot more. So I think we need to face that.
Well, and I was going to make that point. I have an old house, and it feels like once I fix something, I just fix something else afterwards, and it's just a constant. So has that been evaluated as sort of like what kind of in this, there's replace the roof. Yes, we can do that, but then behind that, in a year you're going to be. Has that been studied? That's sort of what's coming down the pipe.
So just to back up a little bit, when in late 2017, we hired a firm, EMG, to perform a condition assessment of our buildings, and that analysis was partly intended to identify any assets that really were not good candidates for additional investment. And if I recall correctly, 2 buildings emerged out of that study as poor candidates for investment. One was City Hall, and the second was the Head Start building. But I don't believe that the library was included because the library did have an addition several years ago. I can tell you our staff notes that the HVAC doesn't work properly within that building, and it's likely inefficient in other ways. But that's a limitation of the building today, along with a roof.
Yeah, that's what I'd heard mention of.
Okay. Mark, I've got another question. Yesterday's city council meeting, the Nolan Tam amendment number 2 was approved, I understand, and that option was to add a second floor to the library. I don't see that here. Is that?
No, the amendment was really intended to fund the analysis related to option B under City Hall, which is the combination brand new library City Hall concept.
Even though the statement on their document says something different? Let me, hold on a second. Their additional service request number 2 stated there were additional concept options. The first one is what we talked about, a new 2-story building. The second bullet was consolidated library and City Hall renovation plus 1-story addition reusing the existing library building. So apparently that's something they're going to do. I've got a lot of concerns about that. If we want to get into the weeds, I got a PowerPoint we can look at. My overall concern is that we could go down a rabbit hole for several months and end up at a dead end. We've got seismic issues, we've got energy efficiency issues, there's all kinds of things of modifying a building that can run into a train wreck. So there's not enough money in what Nolan Tam is doing to do an evaluation at the level of detail I think it would be necessary to see if the thing is truly viable. So I'll stop there.
And there's not a concept of a second floor, so I'm going to look at this again, but that's not their primary focus. The funding, the additional $10,000 on a $280,000 contract, is intended to provide us cost estimates and a configuration of what a 2-story City Hall library building would look like.
Okay.
So just to, I think I've heard, and this Nolan Tam will verify it, but I think I've heard roughly, and maybe Dan, you can speak to it, it's in just sort of broad approximate numbers, is that a second floor runs about 50% of the ground floor in cost. Is that, you guys know that, or? Does anyone, does it get much more complicated than that? Really depends. So even if we, okay. So I was just trying to look at what that might be then as I looked at both buildings all in, if I, ballparked something. But that's what Nolan Tam will get us, I guess, an exact.
Does City Hall need 8,500 square feet, or is that 8,500 square feet include the Stevenson Museum?
No, the City Hall is 8,500 square feet, and the number that was used here included about 2,500 additional square feet for
For the
about
Stevenson.
11,000 and change.
Is that, okay, and that's for the Stevenson Museum?
That includes the Stevenson
Okay,
Museum.
and if the Stevenson Museum went away and didn't want space, or stayed where they were, or moved, or, I'm just making this
I
up.
think it's fair to say that you could place the City Hall building in a way that doesn't conflict with the existing Stevenson Museum, save everyone 2,500 square feet. I think what they were looking at in an earlier configuration included more of a campus setting where buildings were spaced farther apart, and the feedback from the conversation that matured with the council was to consolidate preserve as much space as possible, particularly to the south, and put the City Hall single-story structure, if it was a brand new building, as close to the building as possible, the existing building. So I think the architect could work around the Stevenson Museum in a way that doesn't require its removal, and that $16 million number would be a little lower as a result of that.
Okay. Well, and then just another question then is, so what if I'm just spitballing. So what if the Stevenson Museum, let's say, went into Carnegie with the Historical Society, and then you didn't need any of that, and it just opened your slate up? What I'm just
don't
looking
wanna
at how much
limit-
can we move things around?
Right. I don't want to limit your imagination, because I think that's important, and I think that the task force has some flexibility to consider alternatives like that. I will tell you there are nuances, for example, with that museum. So today they would prefer to have a more improved and self-contained climate control HVAC system that doesn't exist today in order to help preserve some of their collection. And so in a new structure, whatever it would be, their expectation would be to have more of a museum quality HVAC system that preserves their materials.
And now I'm just asking again, spitballing and asking questions. Is that expensive HVAC system the responsibility of the landlord or the responsibility of the tenant? Again, just asking.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
And today we have an agreement with them on that outlines responsibilities, and I'm going to turn to our finance director, who's sitting pretty far away from me over there. But I think that the current responsibilities require the tenant to maintain or to replace certain equipment. We have some responsibilities ourselves, but there's a shared component there.
Okay.
One of the problems that we have is that no one knows what the upgrade cost would be of the Carnegie building.
Yeah.
It's surely not going to be occupied long-term without a significant amount of work.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, we have no input from anybody on what that might be based on a different use. So if we pursue it, then we're going to have to develop that information.
Please use your mic.
Can someone tell me what the current use for the Carnegie building is?
I can tell you that. We essentially use it for programming for Parks and Recreation. And so it's fair to say that it's underutilized in certain capacities. It's nice space for us to use, but on the other hand, it may be able to be used in other ways for the city or beyond. If it's okay, I'd like to just walk you through the remainder of this spreadsheet, and we have a number of other materials that we want to share with you. But this is intended to frame the focus of the committee, and I'm happy to answer additional questions after and beyond, so we'll be able to get into the nuts and bolts. On Streetscape, Streetscape project has been developed into 3 phases, and some of this is influenced by available resources, and other other decisions have been influenced by the Caltrans permitting process. So phase one allows for an expedited review and allows the city to not risk a $1.2 million construction grant that we have. And so this project is on schedule to be to go to construction in January of 2021, which would initially involve the removal of the trees and a few months later replacement of the sidewalks on Main Street between the bridge at Gotts up to the City Hall parcel. That project, if you followed the council conversation about 2 weeks ago, we talked a little bit about how we fund that. We're going to fund it with Measure T, which is a half-cent sales tax for transportation for 25 years. That would require using about $500,000. We receive about $1 million annually, so $500,000 over 2 fiscal years, and then borrowing $2.4 million from the general fund to be repaid probably at a rate of over a 5-year term, repaid by future Measure T revenues. And we're in the infancy of Measure T. We're in about the second year now of that 25 years. So that's how we're planning to deliver phase one, which is why it has an asterisk there, because it requires a loan. Phase two requires a more extensive permitting process because Caltrans has to go through signalization analysis, and that delays the discussion. And we also had an ability to deliver phase one, so we are also in need of postponing that because of the longer term permitting, but also the conversation about how to pay for it. And phase three extends the Streetscape project to Railroad, Oak, Hunt, Adams, sort of the collection of streets that are around the Main Street corridor. And phase three is unfunded. Any questions on Streetscape? Storm drains. This is a number we don't have now. I was hoping that we would have this, knowing that we were going to be making decisions on a lot of projects. We do not have this number yet. It is something that requires additional work, and I don't have a good clarity today on how quickly we're going to have an educated guess. So for purposes of an uneducated guess, I will tell you that my uneducated guess is the way these underground utility master plans work is they will essentially look at all of our assets. We may make calculated decisions on which assets we television survey and get data on these pipes. So we're not going to go to a neighborhood that's just been built. We're going to look at the oldest section of town most likely and the areas that have been causing us problems. And we will TV those sections of pipe, determine what investments are most critical, and our consultant will help us prioritize the most critical of critical projects and then scale that down to projects that don't need investment for a while. My expectation is we're going to find that we have several $1 million of immediate critical investments that we should invest in. It's probably north of $2 million. It would not surprise me if the number is north of $5 million. And I think I should stop in terms of my uneducated guesses with those two figures, because that's based on our experience with Oak Avenue and the failure of the storm drain, where we spent about $500,000 over 2 years dealing with 2 failures. And when we opened up the street, the corrugated metal pipe had essentially disappeared, and there was a hole there. So this year, what we did was the remainder of that section from the completion of that project behind the grocery store to the edge of the creek, we slip lined that, and we're able to deliver a project for a fraction of the cost. But now we need to evaluate, the pipes that feed that section, and I'm expecting that we're going to find some pipes that are very old and in need of replacement.
Will the number that we get be for the totality of the improvements that are required? Okay.
No, what I'd like to focus you on is just the most critical of critical repairs. And so it would be, what would we want to invest in the near term over a 1 to 2 year period that may require other considerations in terms of how we fund that.
Could I make a comment on that? So it seems to me our financial planning goes out 5 years here, and it would make sense, since we're looking at funding alternatives for all these projects, to consider a longer period. I doubt if the city could do everything they need to do in 2 years. So
I think there's going to be some catch up, and then there's going to need to be a schedule that we move into.
Right.
So you're right, we do need to look beyond 2 years, but I think there's going to be a substantial backlog on the most critical of critical assets that need investment or deserve investment. Essentially, what the challenge right now is we're assuming that no sewer pipe, no water pipe, and no storm drain pipe is going to break over the next several years because we haven't committed resources to invest in the replacement. On the sewer side, our funds are entirely committed to delivering the Cornella pump station and the replacement of the wastewater treatment plant, and we're essentially keeping our fingers crossed that we don't lose sewer pipes. But we also know that sewer pipes have a lot of water infiltration because of what's happening at the wastewater plant. So we know that there are limitations to those assets. And then on the water side, we're delivering a very large project, the dam removal project. And that's committed, that and some tank replacement projects will be committing most of the additional capital resources that we have in that fund, which postpones some investments in critical water infrastructure in the pipes from a pipes perspective. But as we begin to deliver the paving projects, we want to make sure that we don't ignore the pipes in the ground, and we try to align the projects in a way that's smart and doesn't require us to pay for repaving twice.
So the question is the crossover between the general fund and the sewer and water enterprise funds. I understand sewer and water are supposed to survive on their own and plan on their own, et cetera. But if we have a major catastrophe on one side or the other, let's say water main burst, the water main between here and Rutherford, I understand, is 80 plus years old, has shown some signs of wear. And if that were to require major investment, would the Chinese wall, between those funds still exist, or would the general fund be tapped to help out in an emergency?
So it's a great question. The money from the water fund or the wastewater fund can't come into the city general fund, but the city general fund can move the other direction. It's not a best practice. Most cities try to avoid it. There are reasonable times when you might consider that on a one-time basis. Some cities who are frowned upon rely on a subsidy rather than using the ratepayers to stabilize that fund. In our case, we use some one-time monies to help with delivery of the York Creek Dam project to accelerate that project and ensure it's funded. But we have discontinued that now, and so the current year budget doesn't include that allocation. That was last year. And so we've had a recent example of some support. You're right, that project is an expensive project. I believe it's been estimated in the $5 million range. It's a good candidate. One of the values of a city getting organized, whether it's the EMG study, the underground utility study, if we're not organized and we don't know the price and the project scope from some of these projects, we're at a competitive disadvantage when we're looking at grant opportunities. So one of the things I'm happy with and pleased with is we're getting ourselves organized in a way where we're able to compete better for some of the funding that may be available on infrastructure. And it continues to be a narrative at the state and federal level, and so we're keeping our eyes on resources that may help offset the cost of some of these projects.
Just quickly, how I don't want to frame it as negatively, but how long shot is getting grants from the state to do these big projects?
We're currently, we had a conversation yesterday about a grant that it's based on census district and the determination of whether it's considered a lower income census district, but there's another way of analyzing eligibility for this particular grant. This particular grant could fund the entire $1 million Cornella pump station project. Mm-hmm. If we're able to, if we perform a study, and we may need to start phase one, may need to be a grant to do the study on a planning grant side. Followed a year later by, and if the analysis on the eligibility determined that we were eligible for this particular neighborhood, then we could compete. We could compete for 100% funding for that project, which would be terrific relief for the fund.
But we compete for it. So
In some
I'm just
cases, it's competitive.
asking.
In fact, this one may not be competitive. Is this a non-competitive? Right. So we would actually, if we qualify, this would be
We would
this
get
would
it.
offset a $1 million project. Our public works director helped with, and our finance department helped with delivery of a grant for guardrails last year that saved the city $500,000+. So we do try to keep our eyes out for grants that will offset resources that otherwise would need to be used at some point.
And is that at all laid out for us as we look at, sort of revenue buckets or revenue streams? Is any of that opportunity spelled?
We haven't counted anything that we haven't already received, but we're on an active hunt for additional resources.
Okay. And then is there anything that might list like what the potential? I'm just thinking, I guess I'm just comparing it to sort of how I run my own business. We call it our pipeline or our lead gen. And so what might be coming in? Is there anything like that?
What we will typically do is ensure that we have an awareness of what's happening at the state and federal governments in terms of funding opportunities. It's important for us to keep an eye on legislation, be active in our professional associations, which are often helping us learn about revenue opportunities or grant opportunities. And there's a lot of money, for example, with housing today. So we're actively looking at grants on housing-related resources. But infrastructure is another one that has a fairly robust funding coming from the state and federal government, but often there are strings attached to that, and we want to make sure that we either are eligible or can live with the strings that are attached. And then,
sorry, is there existing analysis that sort of prioritizes deferred infrastructure issues that we envision that are coming up in the 5, 10 year, 15 year?
The best right now for us with our buildings is our EMG study.
Mm-hmm.
It's a 20-year look.
Okay.
But I can tell you already that some of the data is dated a little, and I know that we have an engineer on our staff that's been tasked with updating that a little bit to make it more contemporary.
And are those items prioritized in terms of which is more critical, or is it? I mean, kind of there's an interface between kind of critical and timing.
No, not at the moment. What we've done, and I was going to get to that in a slide after this, but 3 years ago when I arrived, we had a budget of $50,000 for our building maintenance. The next year we increased that to 100, but we didn't have data yet at the time. And then with the data from EMG, which if you took a look at that 20-year horizon and you excluded City Hall, it essentially said we needed to be committing $400,000 to $600,000, depending on how you looked at it, each year, and that's what inspired the $380,000 in this year's budget, which also anticipated that we would invest in the library roof, which I don't believe EMG. I think EMG missed the library roof, but I'll have to double check that. We know we want to paint the fire station. We have other buildings that need attention. We talked about Scout Hall last night, for example.
A pretty standard way of looking at a piece of real estate is that about 10% of your budget should go towards, a maintenance fund. So I guess I'm baffled that a few years ago they only had $50,000 in the budget for maintenance.
I can tell you some of the story is likely the city had no money because of the recession, and it was an incredibly deep recession for local governments, and when they cut, often maintenance was a budget that they cut, sadly. At the same time, I'm afraid that and this is my experience with small cities, but in medium and large cities where I've spent most of my career, they are generally more people resources and more dollars. And there is money and time invested in taking a chance to plan. And so in small cities, particularly during recessions, my observation is we don't have the bandwidth to take the time to plan because we've cut 10% of our staff or 20% of our staff, and we often don't have the dollars to bring in someone else to do the planning for us, and the planning gets set aside. So that's something that we've been doing over the last couple of years with additional resources, which has been helpful for us to just make an effort at planning. And the EMG report was the first step at really helping us. We were really throwing a dart on a dartboard until we took the time to analyze these assets, which had been aging for quite a long time. Probably would have been appropriate for us to spend more than 10% catching up for many years. Did you have a question?
No, I'm just a little concerned about
Okay.
pace if we're.
Okay, I just brief and then just
50 minutes in.
right. So, if I can continue briefly on the police station, this is just a placeholder estimate. This is me using a 4,500 square foot building. The EMG study looked at our police station, which is 3,500 square feet, indicated that it was a little bit small. We use a former apparatus bay of the former fire department, City Hall, as the evidence storage, and we have some additional storage in that side of the building. And so I'm using 4,500 as a placeholder for calculation purposes, multiplied at the same $1,000 a square foot that Nolan Tam is using for City Hall, plus a 30% markup on soft costs. So that's just a ballpark, but we would need to refine that number. And then if I could go to the next couple of slides. So just briefly on pensions, this is other general fund issues that I want you to be aware of as you think through the challenges. On pensions, I want you to know that we're in pretty good shape. On the safety and non-safety, safety is defined as police and fire. We've never retired a firefighter. That puts us in a really competitive advantage with respect to other communities. Our police are right smack in the middle of affordability, so we pay about the 50th percentile. Half the cities are more expensive, half are less expensive. And then on the non-safety staff, this city never enhanced the retirement formulas in the early 2000s, and as a result, we are in a better position than a lot of cities. So 75% of cities pay a lot more than we do to fund the pension obligations, the employer contribution rate. And then under PEPRA, this is a 2013 effective date for the updated Public Employee Pension Reform Act. One of the silver linings of a city that turned over a lot of staff is we had a lot of staff that were hired after 2013. Now I don't want to let them go because we have good staff, but the fact that we have a lot of employees that were hired after that date means that they're more affordable from a pension standpoint. And more than 50% of our general fund employees are now under the PEPRA Act, which is substantially more affordable. That's a non-safety pension. And then this is just a headwind to be aware of that we're already thinking about. So the discount rate is what CalPERS, our California Public Employee Retirement System, this is their expected rate of investment return. And they had market losses, two very substantial market losses around the time of the recession, and that number has been dropping from 8.25 to 7% this year. And every time it drops, it increases the city's costs. So the last 25 basis points, I think, equated to a little over $200,000 to the general fund. We absorbed that. I will tell you that we have all of our labor contracts coming open on June 30th, and we're anticipating this risk, and it'll be part of our conversations. And CalPERS is currently funded at 71% and looking promising. They would like to get to 90% as quickly as possible, but it's going to take time. And then just another note, retiree health obligations. You'll hear later that we don't have any other post-employment benefit obligations, OPEB, but we do have a sick leave conversion benefit that does have some exposure for us. When I arrived, it was $300,000 in arrears, and we had exposure of $800,000 if everyone retired. But essentially, this allows people to convert their unused sick leave to either a cash out of 50% or 100% for medical premiums. And what we've done to mitigate the cost is before I arrived in 2012, the city discontinued this benefit for non-managers. When I arrived and learned a little bit more about this, we decided to discontinue this for new executive and mid-managers hired after May 8, 2018. And for 2 years now, we've invested $152,000 each year to pre-fund that obligation. Our goal is to fully fund that obligation. And we've had people that separate. We also budget about $25,000 a year for people that separate. And we have an obligation to pay out, so we've started doing that as well. The only eligible staff that are being hired today that could receive this benefit are our police officers that serve at least 10 years within the city and then separate. And then finally, this is just a word of caution related to our fire department. We talked a little bit about this last night with the city council. We have an extraordinary model. It's incredibly efficient. It relies on part-time firefighters, so we're not paying for firefighters to sleep in the station at night. The city has now 2 full-time firefighters. We overlap their 10-hour schedules, and so they work there are 6 days that are covered. Sundays rely entirely on part-time paid per-call firefighters, and all of our evenings are paid per call. So when we contrast ourselves with these other agencies, we're delivering service, high-quality service, because the service is getting better at a fraction of the cost. But my calculus is that if we were investing about 17% of our budget, if we had to continue to professionalize, meaning more full-time employees rather than relying on the part-time support, there's a long-term exposure that would probably equate to about $1.2 million a year annually.
Mark, to what extent has the professionalization of the fire department been built into the long-range financial forecast? Have we assumed no incremental?
I don't believe it was included last year, but it's something that we can run some scenarios on because I can.
Curious, and what would drive us to do that? Would it be the inability to recruit volunteers, or is it a liability kind of a issue?
It's primarily driven by inability to recruit. So I want to congratulate our fire for how efficient they are, and they do raise a lot of resources also that helps fund the apparatus and equipment, and their performance is really unmatched. I can't imagine there's a fire department that can deliver the resources that they do as efficiently as they do. So at this time, I think that would conclude item 5.1, and we have a couple of folks that are going to share their responsibilities under 5.2.
Hi, for those of you who don't know me, I'm April Mitz. I'm the finance director here at the city. Thank you for serving on this committee and helping us get through some of these difficult and looming activities. So I'm going to start with some city revenue trends that we've experienced since 2003. So these have been included in some handouts that should be in front of you. I'm just going to go over them very briefly. All of this is available in through our various CAFRs, through our long-range financial forecast. So you'll see our general fund revenue trends, which is the first chart. From 2003 to 2019 are actuals, and then the 2020 is the adopted. So you can see that our general fund revenue trends have been sloping up. You see some little dips in the years, and that's due to recession and some other outlying expenses. 2019, we did finish strong on that. We ended up having more revenues than we anticipated and less expenses, so that's why you see that little spike up. Right now, with the 2020 adopted budget, we can't forecast where we're completely going to end at the end of the year. I'm hoping the trend is going to continue up, but we still show positive revenue trend growth. The second chart that you have in front of you is property sales and TOT. So out of all of our general fund revenue categories, those are our top three. It's typically anywhere from 80 to 87% of our general fund revenues are these primary revenue sources. So you can see where they're trending. Property taxes are the blue line, sales tax is the orange line, and then TOT is the gray line. And just, I know it has been asked before, but for sales tax and TOT, that information is confidential, and we are legally not allowed to release individual. We can do it as a whole group, but we can't tell you exactly how much each business is actually bringing in for the city. Yes.
Can I ask you for your basic?
Please use your mic. Thank you.
Can I ask you for your basic TOT assumption? Meaning, if there are this many hotel rooms in the city, you know, on which you're charging a certain amount that have a vacancy rate of a certain amount, what's a hotel room worth to the city?
That would really be dependent on the type of hotel it is, whether it's a, 3-star, 4-star, 5-star resort, the amount of
Throw me a
rooms.
number.
I wouldn't even feel comfortable pulling a number without actually researching it, unless Mark has some.
I think another way of answering that question is we have monthly data from our hotels, and we have historical data by month to forecast, and so it influences our decisions on how to budget. Are you looking at revenues?
So what's an average monthly TOT? I mean, I looked in the sort of the totals, which is a few $1 million a year, but I didn't have the number of rooms or room night to divide into that to sort of come up with how you think about that.
So you answer that, and then we can also
I mean, how many hotel rooms are there in St. Helena?
Offhand, Mandy, do you remember how many hotels we have in St. Helena? Are they based on rooms? They are. So those reports, and I can provide the link, those reports are available online. So it's within the finance department, and it's TOT, TID reports. And so that will show what the total number of rooms are, the total, and it does break it down by month. It just doesn't break it down by particular entity. And it does break out the hotels versus short-term rentals. So and if there's a new hotel that goes on board, for instance, when Los Alcobas did, we were able to provide some pretty accurate estimates when they came on board as far as what occupancy is. We did a slow ramp up with Los Alcobas. We factored in a 50% occupancy first year, then ramped it up to what the current revenues are. Does that answer your question?
I think the answer to my question is there's a report. And that I should
There is a
look for
report.
it. I'm just wondering off the top of your head if you think there's property taxes and there's so many pieces of property. There's sales taxes, and there's so many stores. There's transit occupancy taxes, and there's so many hotel rooms, just so that we can get some idea of the worth of build a hotel on a property, sell a piece of property to a hotel, how we can understand that. And that was not in the few hundred pages of material that you gave us to review in the last 2 weeks.
I think that we have a pretty good ability to analyze potential. And it would depend on the quality of the hotel. If it's a 5-star hotel, we're talking to people that would sell those rooms for $1,000 or $1,500 a night, and we can forecast that with a certain occupancy assumption. And we did have a hotel analysis performed by the Cosmont team about 6 months ago. So we have a report, and did we post that?
Yes.
It's on the it's on the task force website now that analyzes hotel potential.
So as we think about this, what would be handy, and Patrick, this is coming off of your question, because as we sit down, and I think of this as like we're laying a bunch of stuff out on the board and like looking for solutions and trying to creatively think. So what kind of tools will help us in that process? And what would be sweet would be to have like hotel room, I don't know, just ABC, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, and each hotel room, you can look, I'm just making this up like they're little chits. Each hotel room kicks off $3,000 a year in TOT, and then we can, use some of these rough numbers to help with our problem solving.
Right, and we can. That is not a hard task for us to put together some fairly good calculated guesses on revenue, depending on the number of keys.
Okay.
Excuse me. Somebody just helped me out by looking up the report online in answer to Task Force Member Kennedy's question. So, for instance, you'll see in July 2019, the gross rent reported was $2,629,463. Total rooms available is 283.
That's the number.
The room nights available would be 8,773. The rented.
I think all of us could do the math. It was just a matter of there was a data piece missing.
Yeah. So it is there, and so we'll be able to access it. Just want to let you know. Thank you.
Super.
And I'll provide that information to Priya as well, so they can provide a link to your particular session of it, because we do update that and we provide it quarterly to our TID committee meeting that we have quarterly with the local hotels. So, Okay, so we'll go back, just real briefly, some other points to the chart for property sales and TOT. So you do see a couple big, upticks on it, particularly 2017 when it comes to sales tax. Big uptick was the passage of Measure D. So it was a half-cent sales tax measure that was passed by the residents of St. Helena. It does not have a sunset, so that's in perpetuity, so that will keep going. It first went online at the very end of fiscal year 17. Fiscal year 18 was the first time that we saw that big bump up in it. For fiscal year 19, we did put in an estimated $1.8 million of additional revenue that we do receive from Measure D. Additionally, we have Measure T that comes in, and so just that does not affect the general fund per se. We have a separate fund that Measure T houses, and that, as Mark alluded to, it is a 25-year half-cent sales tax as well. Unfortunately, the formula that's based on Measure T isn't straight that we get a half-cent sales tax. There's a formula that's divided county-wide. So for fiscal year 19, our actuals, we received $960,000 for that. We're estimating this year is going to be about the same, so $960,000 to $1 million for it. And this is a big improvement from our maintenance of effort that we had provided before for any street road repairs we did. We were investing approximately $400,000. $380,000 is what we're investing per year on it. So now we have that $380,000 that we are already investing. In addition, we have about another $1 million a year that are going specifically to our roads, and that's something that's very good for all of the cities within Napa County, because otherwise that would have been have to be general fund supported. So we are able to do additional street projects we wouldn't have been able to do.
Quick question, where in Measure D, is that earmarked for anything? So Measure T is earmarked for roads, and Measure D, is that earmarked for anything?
It is not. It's a general sales tax, so it can be used, so it goes into the general fund to be used for general purposes.
Great.
So. Yes.
If we borrow against TOT, future TOT revenues as proposed for the phase 1 of the sidewalk improvement project, do the payments for that come out of future T revenues, or can they come from any revenue source?
It would come from how we are looking at structuring it right now. It would come from future Measure T revenues. But what we can do, and it's very common practice, so let's say we need the additional $2.4 million shortfall, we can borrow the money from general fund, and then the general fund is paid back future Measure T revenues. There is no stipulation. The city council is the governing body that would make the decision whether they want to pay it back in 5 years and 10 years, so we can draw it out.
My real question is, does it come out at the cost of future road improvements?
It would come out of the future road improvement plans, so we'd have to work to see what, we'd have to work with Public Works on how we divide up those plans. Okay. The next chart that you'll see is the top 3 general fund revenues as a percentage of the general fund budget. So historically, again, you'll see property taxes, the blue, sales taxes, the orange, and TOT is the gray. So you can see where it trends anywhere from about 70% all the way up to a little over 80%. So those are our 3 biggest sales tax drivers, or biggest general fund revenue drivers. So any questions on the general fund or the revenues?
I have a quick question. I remember hearing something about, I guess it's like a pipe supply place that moved to Calistoga.
That'd be A&J Vineyard Supply.
So
Correct.
and I had just heard mentioned, like, oh, when someone like that leaves, it's a palpable, we feel it in town in terms of sales tax revenue.
We do feel it, and
Check that out.
yeah, we do feel it, and the city does hire Muni Services to do our sales tax forecasting for us. So we meet with them quarterly, and we talk about what businesses are coming and which businesses are going, and they add that into their forecast for us, and they're able to forecast baseline recession model, if, very, very positive, hey, this is where we're going to think it stay, or a recession model, so they factor that into their revenue forecasts. So if there's no other questions on general fund. The next area, both Mark and I are going to be talking about this, is just a little more insight to the city pension liabilities. And so the next 3 charts that I'm going to refer you to, these were created, the first 2 were by Bartel and Associates. They actually provided actuarial services for us. So they took all of the information from CalPERS as far as what the discount rate is, what we think our projections are, and they've done some projections for us. The first chart, and this is based off of the 6/30 2016 valuation. So this one, we are currently working on updating this. And so this is off of that valuation. Oh,
Is this an infrastructure question? Or is this just context for the infrastructure?
This is context
discussion? 'Cause
for
I think
the-
we got the basic point from Mark earlier that the pension liability exists and what basic size it is. And I'm worried that we're going down into the details of some of the peripheral issues and not, we're sort of a task force with 6 meetings left in our life and anxious to get into, the stuff we're focused on.
Okay, yeah, then we'll go to the third chart. It's a small little chart, so we can talk about the swing. So again, these are sensitivities that when we're developing our budgets, when we're developing our projections, that we do have to take into consideration. It's called the sensitivity of the net position liability to changes at the discount rate. The center section where it says current discount rate of 7.15 and the net pension liability. So the 11.5 is what we currently owe. When you see, if for some reason they increase, like if they decrease what their discount rate is by 1%, you can see it bumps up. So instead of the city owing $11 million, it now bumps up to $17 million. So we just wanted to be able to show, and this is also available in our CAFR, what the swing could be. Likewise, if they have a great return rate and they increase it by 1%, it would decrease our net pension liabilities to 6.7. So we kind of put that together just so you can see how volatile PERS is. And it is something definitely when we develop our long-range financial forecasting, we do take this into consideration because if we plan a very large project, we have, large payments and all of a sudden there's a swing one way or this other on it, it can severely impact our ability to actually provide services. And then Mark, did you? Okay, so we're going to that. So the next portion is going to be presented by Mark Walsh, and he's going to talk about our current general fund debt that we have.
I'd just like to make a quick comment.
Yes.
TOT is far and away the most volatile source of revenue or potential loss of revenue that we have because it's more greatly influenced by the economy than sales tax and other sources that we have. So we just need to keep an eye on that.
Thank you very much, April. And I am going to be brief. We were going to walk through the CAFR and the budget. It would just take too much time. So what I want to put into context is the big 3 revenues that we went through, those feed the fiscal forecast. And the main sources to get your estimates, the assessor's office, we pull the estimates for property tax. For TOT, we look at our historicals, and then we use an expert for the sales tax. And that feeds the big 3 top revenue line. Next item in the budget for a general fund is going to be payroll. The biggest unknown is your pension liabilities. CalPERS rates can go up or down. So when we look at the discount rates, like having a variable rate loan on your house, when you look at how long people live and how long you're going to have to pay them, it's like you have a variable priced house. And that's why we bring an actuary to tell us how much do you think we're going to have to budget for the next 10 years. So that's some of the underpinnings of any fiscal forecast for a general fund. And now what I want to do is just walk through the liabilities that we have, and they're on page 37 of that financial report. Hope you have a copy somewhere in there. And that'll be the financial report at June 30, 2019.
And we've provided a link to the CAFR on the task force website.
Okay, great. And so what I just wanted to point out, for the governmental activities, the ending balance at June 30, 2016, or the annual requirement, was about $1,092,000. The city had paid off significant debt for the state revolving loan. That was $5.8 million 3 years ago, and they're now reporting nothing for that. And the requirements within the next year for your general debt is $292,000. So that's the good news. The other issue is that what's not reported on here are potential changes in the pension obligations that we talked about. Deferred maintenance is not in here. We talked about that as well. So I just wanted to point that out, that there is some good news. Some debt service that we've been funding over the last 3 years has gone down. And that might provide a resource for us to look at also. And our fiscal planning as we go forward is going to reflect that. And then as far as the capacity to borrow, I'm going to refer people to the July 23rd, 2019 presentation. It's listed as a resource on the website. And that's Ken Deeker from Del Rio Advisors is going through the types of debt that a city can incur to finance capital facilities. And that's just about it for me. So,
And what's the final number you think? How do you think about that borrowing capacity in simple terms?
I didn't do the capacity analysis, and so it depends on what type of borrowing. Is it general obligation bond or is it capital lease financing? Capital lease financing is different because you have to capitalize the interest as it goes. And then but if you see Ken's presentation, he'll give some sample numbers, but he didn't do the final analysis yet. That would come after the long-range financial forecast. Thank you.
Okay. And I'm just going to really briefly go over the last two slides that you have, or the last two charts that you have for our general fund reserve for our policy and performance. So before we had it, the City Council had an informal policy of a 25% reserve level. In late 2018, City Council did formalize that to a 30% reserve level. So you'll see the very first chart that you have is the unassigned fund balance as of 6/30 historically from 2007 until what our estimated 2020 is. So you can see where kind of the reserve levels dip down. As it relates to that, the unassigned reserve percentage, so the next line graph that you have, you can see a couple big notable dips. Just for your information and just for your knowledge on it, the large dip in 2015 is largely attributed to the $1.9 million FEMA payback that we had to do. So you see a large dip in your reserves there. The uptick starts in 2017 with Measure D. And then 2019, as we stated earlier, ended up with more revenues than we anticipated and less expenses. And then this year you see a slight decrease in what we're anticipating. And some of that does have to do with additional assets and or additional investments in assets, as Mark alluded to earlier, with the $380,000 plus the other $250. So you'll see kind of some variations. And then we'll usually get our audited financials we just got published our 2019 on December 31st. So these 2020, it will constantly be moving, and we do provide quarterly updates to the City Council. So any questions on the fund reserves? Okay.
So we're at a point on the agenda where we've scheduled a discussion for the designation of possible subcommittees, and you may alternatively want to have a conversation about a task force chair and vice chair now, or we can continue to postpone that.
Could we go over the responsibilities of the chair? What are the expectations of those two positions?
So the chair would be responsible for managing the discussion. I would expect to meet with the chair and or the vice chair before meetings to plan the agenda, make sure that we're that we're thinking through the meeting, making sure that we're developing an agenda that will meet the time expectations, etc. The chair would be the person that receives questions from other members of the task force and work, and probably fair to say a few more hours of work liaisoning with city staff, whether it's Priya or myself, April or Mark.
I'd like to see us have a subcommittee essentially entitled Real Estate to deal with possibilities as are outlined in other documents. So it's just a suggestion. I think that it's narrows the vision, and it also tends to deal with nuts and bolts and practicality. So I would suggest that committee be formed.
So just a word on the subcommittees, because I've always anticipated that a lot of your work will be accomplished via ad hoc committees, And of course, we have to limit the participation to no more than a quorum, less than a quorum. So we're talking about 3 or less for each of the committees that you form. I've always anticipated that that would be a vehicle for you. So I know that some of you have shared with me some thinking that you've already put together regarding possible subcommittees. A real estate subcommittee is one of the various ideas that I've been provided a copy of, and what we would expect the chair to do at this point in time would be to ask for some consensus among the committee members, the task force members, that we have a quorum that supports the idea of a real estate ad hoc subcommittee. So I can do that by a raise of hands, or we can have more discussion on that.
I think it might be useful to look at what the other committees might be.
Yeah.
I think that I've done some thinking about this, and I know others have. In my analysis, it seems to me that real estate development is going to be a key one. To look at the development opportunity of the various sites, what kind of a hotel could be put there, what's the TOT potential, not an average number, but a proposed number. So that would be one. I think another would be finance and budget, which is to look at the city's current financial situation, current budget, CIP, long-term financial plan, and find out what the risks are to that because of all these unbudgeted projects we have, and what relief might be available to fill the gap. And then I have a third one, which is construction, which is to look at the actual projects. Do they make sense? Will they fit on the site? Or the costs make sense? So have the construction people on us. And then from my experience in the grand jury, I proposed that we have also an editorial committee, which wouldn't kick in until the end of the project, but somebody's got to write a final report. And for those who have done this know that it's best to have a limited number of authors on the report. So the proposal I had, and anybody's welcome to look at this if they wish, would be 4 committees. One would be finance and budget, one would be real estate development, one would be construction, and the last being editorial.
Yeah, and then I have a quick question. A lot of whatever we do will impact something like housing, and we're behind the 8 ball in housing in terms of being in town. So is that even being looked at? Because let's say we go in and go, okay, we got 3 new hotels, but those are all going to create jobs, which we don't have enough. We have issues around. So would that even fit into any of this, or would this at least be into this sort of bigger 30,000-foot view thinking?
Right. I think sometimes it's going to, I think the staff is going to, and we'll talk about this in a little bit later in the agenda, but there'll be certain questions that we don't see as in scope. And I think housing, unless there's some additional benefit, for example, that comes with an idea that is tied to housing, I would recommend that that's not part of the scope of work per the resolution that the council adopted. But if it's an ancillary benefit that comes from an idea related to a real estate deal, for example.
But we don't come in with it. We don't come in trying to look at our pieces on the board going, okay, housing's an issue, revenue's an issue, bodies in town are an issue. Here's all the things we have to take into consideration as we sort of problem solve this.
Right.
Housing isn't on the list.
I think if it's an ancillary benefit that comes with it, I mean, I can foresee a situation where there may be a parcel, for example, that becomes part of a mix of an attractive public-private partnership, and it's a housing play that answers a question for the city on the housing side and also provides an additional incentive for an investor to consider an investment in our capital assets.
I've got one other question, I guess, for you, Mark. We've got $40-some million in alternatives on City Hall, library funding. There's another $8 million on Railroad Avenue, Adams Street roadwork. So we've got potential for a very high amount of money. The question I've got is, what is this committee's role with respect to decision-making at the city council? Do we wait until the preferred alternative is selected, or do we work with the city council somehow or other to narrow the alternatives? What's the vision of the committee's role with respect to narrowing down the alternatives?
I think there's language in the reso that's very helpful and instructive with respect to this. I'm not going to bring it up quickly enough. I don't know if you're able to bring it up on the screen, but my answer to that question is that your analysis will inform what we have the ability to build or construct or renovate. And it may be that some of your analysis may conclude that the ambition's too large. And for that reason, we don't recommend you pursue, Y and Z. You can only afford X. And that's going to be helpful for the council to receive. You may also come up with an idea that says, if you'd like to deliver Y and Z, here's how you might consider doing it. Or here are a couple of different ways on how you would deliver these lower priority but attractive projects. Or you may recommend that it's just not within the city's capacity to fund. And I'm afraid I don't have my glasses today, so I think the first sentence under H. Can you read that, Priya? Oh, that's helpful.
Provide a narrative report describing task force recommendations to the city council regarding. Is that the resolution?
The first bullet point there. It's
evaluation of the city's financial capacity, financing vehicles, and revenue producing potential and options.
So this is really this is your constitution. And we did talk at the council about the idea that we want to try to make sure that it's not open to too much interpretation, but I anticipate that we will have questions about exactly what does this mean, and that's reasonable for us. And if we need additional clarity, we can seek that. I am, by the way, anticipating inviting our chair, whoever the chair or vice chair is, to the council meeting of February 5th to provide a brief update to the city council, and we'll probably want to continue that into the March-April timeframe.
So you got the second bullet and the sub-bullets. So number one that starts with prioritization. So that's really prioritization of improvements associated with City Hall, library, community rec, downtown streetscape, and storm drain. So that really does say that we do try to prioritize a feasible way to get through this.
Right, and I'm expecting that you're going to tell us that, or tell the council, your recommendations move to the council. So you may help us prioritize what, and I will tell you that City Hall is, of all of the buildings here, is at the top of the list from a priority standpoint. And the others are really open to recommendations from this task force on how we deliver those or not deliver those.
Yeah, I think it's going to be pretty clear from the number we've seen so far that there isn't enough forecastable revenue in the pot to pay for these things. So certainly, even to get to the top priority things, there's going to be an incremental revenue requirement. And the question is, where does that come from? And how much could TOT drive? What are the sites that could deliver TOT? How much? Are there other funding sources? Bond issues?
Is that helpful?
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
I mean, I think this is a pretty good, format. If anybody doesn't have any problem with what Mr. McBroom has laid out, I think that that's a really good way to look at it with 4 different committees, subcommittees, and I do not have capacity to be chair right now. I have way too much work going on and travel, so for work. So
I would like to start out with a unvolunteer on my deal. I think the chair should have significant experience in the financial side of this project. And my only being in town for 2 years, I don't have the history on a lot of this stuff, and I don't have the financial background. My financial background has been what's the scope of the project, what's the cost of the project, what's the schedule, and how do we execute. So that will be something I'll be working on, but I don't think I've got the financial wherewithal to be chair.
Everyone's jumping up.
I just have a limitation that I am, at least a few days a week in the city, and I'm worried about being an effective liaison back and forth to the city staff. I mean, the running of a meeting and coming up with a final report, I think, again, any of us can do, but it's that if the local fact finding and reporting is an added 50%, it's tricky for me.
If no one is willing to step up, I am happy. I don't have the financial background you do, but I'm halfway decent at bird dogging, and I don't think quite as many hours. I don't know if Tom, you put together this awesome,
I know I'm going to regret
this. Thing. You'd make an awesome chair.
My background's probably a pretty good fit for this. I'm retired. I am spread thin on a lot of other nonprofit stuff. I'm a pretty good carpenter if any of you guys need one. But I'd volunteer to do this. If I had a really strong second in command who understands the real estate development field, Mr. David.
Yeah. As long as Tom's doing all the work and I get some of the credit, I'm all for it. It's a great formula. I am strong on the finance side. I'm strong on the development side, the real estate side. So I'm happy to play that role.
All right.
So
I think the key to this is going to be really a realistic understanding of what the development opportunities are in town. Take the emotion out of this, look at what the revenue potential is from these various sites, and does it fill the need that we certainly have on all the infrastructure side. So I think that would be a good team.
I'll volunteer for the real estate development subcommittee, and I could also do construction if needed.
Could I pause us for just a second and go back to, if you remember our first meeting, of Rosenberg's rules, and maybe we start with a formal motion that would recommend an appointment of the chair, and then a second motion and vote for the appointment of a vice chair. Discussion. I don't know that you've had the discussion, and then move from there into the committee appointments, if that's okay. And actually, you would need to take a vote on confirming which committees. So we have an idea of 4, and so we would look to someone to make a motion to create those in a second. But if we start with the chair and vice chair, that may be easier to walk all the way through.
So I nominate Tom and George as chair and vice chair respectively.
Second.
And we're capturing your record here, so we want to make sure that we have a record of who that was. Okay, good. And then why don't we do it with a show of hands for now? Okay, so that's unanimous. And so you have a chair and a vice chair. We left the seat open for the chair if the chair would like to sit there for the remainder of the meeting.
The bullseye is right there.
Probably got a button you push and shocks.
We'll find your name tag at the next meeting.
He's got 2 microphones.
And then I know there are ideas related to the committees.
So can we move that these committees be created substantially as they are, subject to, refinement by the chairman as he sees fit later?
Yes. So
Let's do that.
is that a motion?
Yes.
Just some background on this. Is really why I formed. I just was working out in the yard actually and started thinking about how this should go together. So there's no great science in how this was put together. I think the people that are interested in this, into these various subjects, can certainly fine-tune this, and working with Mark, make sure we don't wander off the reservation too far and get into areas that the city's not looking for input on. I hope nobody diagrams that sentence.
I would second the motion that's on the floor for adoption of these committees.
So the chair can ask for all in
Is there
favor.
any further debate first?
No.
Hearing
Thank
none. All in favor, raise your hand, please. Okay, motion carries. Now I think we should talk about membership, and we could have some discussion about who has the time and inclination, ability to serve on which. I think we just go around the room if you want.
Now, I have a question. Are we to volunteer for a committee as chair and sub-chair?
Probably not.
You don't have that option, Mr. David. You're both. I don't know. I think the committee should decide that. The subcommittee should decide that.
And then, did you say that each committee should have no more than 3 people?
There should be no more than 3, but you also have additional resources with some of the volunteers that have indicated their willingness to help. So you may want to bring in extra people as part of that ad hoc. And the staff anticipates that from time to time you may want us to attend any of those meetings. So we're happy to work with you.
Okay.
So with that, I think we go around the room and see if we have volunteers
Okay.
for particular committees.
So I'd like to volunteer for construction.
As chairman, I'm not going to chair one of these, but I think I should be on construction also.
Who's keeping the notes of this?
We're gonna start, and then we may need to amend the different names.
I'll volunteer for real estate development.
Finance and editorial.
Can I just get a repeat of that? Was that you, Member Keneally?
Finance, I'd volunteer to serve on the finance and the editorial committees.
Just to back up for a minute, I'll be volunteer for editorial also.
Development, real estate development.
I would dip in at real estate development and construction.
Okay. And I don't know if I'm going to be much of an asset on, I mean, you don't have much left in terms of these committees, so I don't know if I'm going to be a giant asset or much of an asset for finance and budget, considering I have more of a business background than a finance background. But I'm happy to step up because looks like that's where we could use another person. Editorial sounds dreadful.
That's going to be the heart of this.
So I don't want to do that one.
I think the
Pardon?
the real estate development people are going to give us a lot of the data that goes in this, but the heart of this analysis is in that budget and finance committee.
Okay.
And we do have a CEO for hire here in Glenn. So Glenn is a special, just for those who don't know, is a subject matter expert, but his expertise is in finance and CEO for hire, so he'd
Cool.
be able to help.
Great. I will step up there. I can learn a lot, too, from being on it. Thank you.
Quick question: do the subject matter experts throw us into are they counted in the forum or quorum? I mean,
They're not counted towards the quorum.
We have another financial expert here, I believe.
Tom.
Tom, I know you were sitting next to me, and I was impressed with what you said, and we want to make sure we use you. Smart man.
I think Tom would be another important asset on that
Yeah.
budget and finance committee. Been around town, seen a lot of proposals from the city, and
So the budget and finance is Tom, Patrick, and me.
he's a sidewalk
Aye.
proponent.
And Glenn.
Oh, and Glenn. Good. Great.
And just a word on the ad hoc. These are meetings that you can have at the coffee shop, at a house, out of town. You have all the flexibility to work through that. What we want to be careful about is the communication between committees, so that it's better that we have reports out via the broad meetings like this to identify issues that you'd like the subcommittees to work on again. So that's how I'm envisioning that the committee will operate on the every other week schedule, is you will bring back reports from the work that's being done, share, and then ask for additional work to be done or resources needed, etc. So I have, we do not have, we have 3 on each and 2 on the editorial. Two members on finance and budget, 3 on real estate, 3 on construction, and 2 on editorial.
And I'm sorry, the editorial is Tom and Patrick, bless your hearts. Thank you.
Who's the third member on construction?
Construction is Richard, Tom, and Dan.
Okay.
Richard, Tom, and Dan. Okay. Philippa, Dan, and George for real estate development. Okay.
And we'll provide you a summary of everyone's affiliation.
And who was the municipal finance expert that you named? Is he available to the finance committee directly?
Well, we have and I should mention this, we have consultants that have worked with us that we still have some resources available. So for example, with Cosmont, I think we have some resources in their contract. If there are modest, requests, I think we'll be able to accommodate a presentation or a liaison. Maybe it's just you need an hour or two on a telephone call or a half hour. We can work with that and we'll connect you to those resources. We did invest in 8 hours a week with Mark. Mark is a retired finance director, IT director, CPA, and serves as a city's CPA consultant. And so he's able to, we're making him available to this committee as well.
I was asked this question earlier about you and your staff and your availability, because especially as we start out, we're trying to establish the scope of these investigations. A lot of the stuff you already know and know where it is can keep us from duplicating. Also, some things that have virtually already been decided and are not worth our time to unearth. So would you be available, for instance, to sit with this finance committee and get them started on what the real issues are in terms of unbudgeted projects?
Absolutely, and we do want you to ask as many questions as possible. We've reserved time on here for a discussion today about questions that we've received, along with resources that we've found for you, or in other cases where we think it may be slightly outside the scope of the work. But we want you to continue to submit questions to Priya that you would like answers to, and we will make ourselves available, whether it's April or myself or Priya, to attend meetings, answer questions, however you would like to do it.
So we can click.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I'll go over the website later, and it will outline those document requests have been uploaded to the website. So I'll go over all that. But I think that's a good idea.
And then I have a quick question too. Is it possible, two things, to get like a contact list for us? Is that cool? That so and so for each of us, so we all have each other. We have one place where we can just go look and find each other. Is that cool? Yeah.
Yes, I can provide that.
Okay. Email, phone number, name. That's cool. And then one other question, because this is all just coming. These questions are coming out of just all these conversations I have out there. So I know we're looking at these different hotel projects, which is going to affect revenue, which is going to affect financing ability, and all this. So did you say we could get some sort of summary of the various projects and where they are, and what the constraints and opportunities and all that? Some sort of. It's going to have all that. No, I'm not talking about the buildings themselves. I'm talking about potential deal flow as it comes into the city. Yeah, like, so, okay, what's the likelihood of haul? What are the constraints? What are the opportunities? What's the sort of timeline? What do we think? So as we look at these, because I hear, hotel there, hotel here, but then every one of them, if they all have hair on the pig, so
we only have one application that's under review today. It's the Farmstead Hotel project, and we can share with you probably easiest through the committee, to the real estate committee, for example, to just share with you what the timing is on that. We can talk to the finance committee about the potential revenue that we analyze off of that. There will be as that project moves forward, there will be a development agreement that would require the developer to improve and realign the Mills Lane, for example, with Grayson, and there would be a repayment of some of that cost to the developer via TOT. So it's an example of there would be a delayed, while it may be $1 million a year, it will be 2 years before that's able to be realized unless there was some form of a cost share that metered some additional increment to the city. So there will be nuances to some of these projects that we'll need to think about as well.
Cool. What would be helpful, I think, for me as I just think about it, it would be like some sort of grid that lays out the project and then has, sort of opportunities, constraints, so that it's easy, again, to kind of get a 30,000-foot view of, I feel like I'm showing up and the football game's been going on all day and now I could try to figure out where the ball is.
And I think most of that information is available.
Okay.
This is in the case of hotels, it's a pretty limited portfolio. There's a lot of chatter about ideas, but there's only one submittal right now and one hotel that's been approved.
Okay.
That could be built tomorrow.
So I'm trying not to ask a political question, but a best practices one. We all took a look at these financial reports that showed the city's current indebtedness and forward-looking budgets and whatever. From a management standpoint, what's the borrowing capacity you sense the city has inside industry best practices? Not what does it have the political will to borrow, but what without starting to get scary, is the unused borrowing capacity of the city now? Because it strikes me that the, sell property, allow hotels, borrow money, those are sort of the fundamental trade-offs that we're facing, and there's a little bit of blurriness in each of them, and collectively that produces a big blur. So on the issue of borrowing, can you sort of orient us of what could we borrow without a problem and what would start to stretch us?
Okay. We did ask one of our consultants, Ken Deeker, to prepare that analysis for the city, and there is a direct link, I think, on the website now to his presentation. And if I'm recalling the presentation correctly, the way that we're able to borrow is against insured assets, and our insured assets that are reasonable, that are not in play, for example, really wind down to essentially the fire station building. So we don't believe that the ability to borrow extends too many buildings beyond the fire station. The revenue potential drops off quite a bit. If the library, for example, wasn't in play, that maybe opens up additional numbers. But 8 to 10 million was the number that I'm recalling.
And the rough grid that was in the first slide that we showed today was between $30 and $60 million worth of projects. So just the borrowing alone could install the debt service on $10 million worth of borrowing is hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in a general plan, a general fund of around $15 million. So I just want to make sure that we're, the reports all started off with a note of fiscal caution, and at the same time we're being asked to opine on $60 million of projects in a town that has general fund revenue of $15 million. Something feels a little odd as we start off.
So most likely that list of projects isn't going to be 40, it's going to be something way less than
But we
that.
also have revenue that can be pledged for borrowing purposes. And as we think in terms of these large projects, clearly we need to have a revenue source that will provide the debt service to allow us to borrow the money. So I think we're looking at that as opposed to the existing assets.
I think we can bring a lot of sharpness to the discussion, but a lot of the stuff that I've read in the local press and heard seems pretty fuzzy and pretty emotional. But I think we'll be able to get you hard numbers, but the very basics seem difficult at the start.
And that's one of the reasons you're here, to help us
I would think that is the
help us
reason.
prioritize. And
All right, just
I
want to
think
make sure that's the case, because
It's you can't have the Ferrari. We got to look at a Chevy. So
So we have completed 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, and item 4. We did reserve time to revisit the task force schedule and timeline to confirm that this date and time works for you. We worked with the school district to reserve space, and so when we're in here for these meetings, which it's easy for us to record, it requires us, if we're going to modify the schedule, which I think we've held time for the next every other week for
Is
6
it
weeks.
Every other Wednesday or something?
Right. So we've reserved that time. If you would like to revisit that, we can. Otherwise, it would be helpful for us to set a recurring schedule for these meetings so that we can plan from an agenda posting standpoint in coordination with the school district.
So just so I'm clear, so the next one would be 26, 11, 25?
Yes, I'm going to read it off for you. So the next meeting would be February 26th at 3 o'clock, March 11th, March 25th, April 8th, and April 22nd. And all the meetings are at 3 p.m.
Well, I can actually do it.
And I'll put this all on the website so that everyone has it.
So, Chair, I don't know if we want to make sure that we have agreement that this schedule works for everyone moving forward.
Are there any objections to the every other Wednesday at 3 through the dates that have Priya's mentioned?
And,
No,
and
that's
you're
it.
welcome to revisit that at any time
Sure.
as the work produces, as the work moves forward.
Do we have one on the 8th of April? Was that in that? Okay, that is the week of Passover. We have to probably, maybe
we'll be talking to each other.
I know that I personally can't do that date, so, and I assume because it's not Easter week or whatever, that might be the only one that we might reschedule.
I can pull them all out. I can swing it. I hate to say this, Chairman McBroom and Mark, I have to catch a flight, so may I duck out? I'm going to Bend.
You didn't read the fine print in your contract.
You're going to stick me on the editorial committee?
Yeah.
Could I ask a question about the logistics of the committees? Do the committees get together and meet and appoint a person in charge of that committee to set meetings, to call meetings, blah, blah, blah? Because I think we need to understand that process.
It's really something that we can
Yeah,
bring
I
back
think-
to you and formalize. And I think the other option is you can make a recommendation and we can formalize it at the next meeting.
I think we should talk about it a little bit right now. I mean, my thinking is that the subcommittee does need to meet, between these meetings to get some work done.
Yeah, otherwise we're going nowhere.
And I think that the people that have volunteered for those committees should get together either after this meeting or sometime and decide when they're available to get together. And I would imagine the first order of business might be to select a leader, but it might be to start figuring out what research needs to be done and start setting up interviews or determining what documents need to be seen. Because I think by the time we hit here in 2 weeks, it would be nice to have a briefing from each subcommittee on what they've been able to accomplish so far, even if that's just getting organized and getting some requests for information out.
Do you want to just talk about this after this meeting in our groups?
Dan, you're on both construction and development, is that correct? Okay.
Okay, and our final item tonight, or this afternoon, is 5.5, discussion and review of document and information requests. And Priya has a growing and evolving web spreadsheet for you.
Thank you, Mark. So I have passed out a spreadsheet to everyone. It looks like this. It's the bigger one. And what I've done is I have committee members have submitted requests for information. And so we thought it would be easiest to show what the answer is and then the supporting document. And we also added a column within scope. So I'm not going to specifically go through this list, but just to point out that question number 6, 7, and 8 on the first page, for example, reference enterprise funds. And because we're only focusing on general fund, that is not within the scope, so we didn't provide an answer. And then what I've done is I have added, so I put up our website on the screen, and you can see that I'll be adding links to each agenda. And then I have resource documents here, and I will be adding more as we receive questions. And also because there's been a request to have this on the website, I think that actually would be very helpful. Just know that there might be duplication. And then I have more supporting documents down here, and those kind of reference the resolution that establishes this task force, which I know Mark referenced earlier today. So are there any questions about how to submit information or obtaining it?
I have a question.
Yes.
Some of these questions don't look like they came from us. Are they, is the public or anyone else submitted questions to you? And are
No,
they-
these are only members of the task force that have submitted these questions.
I've got a question on 5, the storm drain. There has been a discussion about, and as I understand, we don't currently have a scope. So this one will be coming down the road a bit. But I just came out of Orinda, who went through the same situation, having to figure out with PG&E, water lines with East Bay mud and storm drains and paving the roads, how to not end up digging up the road 3 times because nobody talked to each other. So is that part of our scope, is to try, because we're going to have to come up with a schedule. So who do we, how do we get this thing? Do we wait until the city engineer comes up with a plan, or what's the next step on that one?
So this is a consultant that we've had under contract for about a year. The first 6 months we invested in a digital document conversion program. So we basically spent 6 months digitizing all of our documents.
You had
And so
drawings of all the pipe.
we postponed that work for about
Okay.
6 months. And I have an update telephone call coming shortly, and I'm going to try to get you some updated information. The scope of that contract deals with sewer, water, and storm drain infrastructure. So our focus would be on the storm drain. What we don't have right now is the television survey data from those storm drains. So what we rely on is an age-based analysis until the actual data from the video. It's, in my view, it's incomplete without the video. So what we need next step is to get the video work done, run it through an engineer that looks at the camera and the pipes, and then assesses the condition of the pipe and makes recommendations on whether it's most critical or can be pushed out a little bit.
In terms of schedule, I would assume what we're looking at is a macro level.
program.
Like how many miles or hundreds of thousands of dollars are we going to need each year, not so much the micro of coordinating PG&E and the phone company and all that stuff. I think it's a macro.
Just that there's a
budgeting.
plan to do so. That's the only, my only concern is we lived in a town that dug up the street 3 times and paved it 3 times. And so it is not easy to get PG&E and others all together you can come up with a plan, and we can't give a cash flow without it. So I should just trying to understand how that's going to move forward.
Right, and we have arrangements now where we provide notice to PG&E and others of our forthcoming projects, and that was an example this year. Was it Kearney? I think Kearney was slated for an overlay this current year, this past summer. It was postponed because PG&E saw our notice, realized that they needed to put infrastructure in. I believe it was a gas line project. And so that went forward. We also, I think, wanted to put a water line replacement in. And so that project has been postponed a year. But there's also language in that notice that says if you don't tell us now, those repairs
Are on you.
would be on them, yes.
That's
For a
good.
period of time, I believe it's about 3 years.
I do a lot of walking around town, and you'll see USA Underground Service Alert. Every sidewalk's got something on it. So people are communicating, but that's the cost of this is more in putting things back together than the actual cost of the pipe. So anyway, so we only want to do it once.
That's correct. Any additional questions on documents now? This will be a living document, as I mentioned, and we'll continue to add to it. I anticipate we may also want to create a space for subcommittees up here. So if there's documents that are being produced by the subcommittee, we can create a space for those documents on the website.
And did you say you'd be available after the meeting for questions on specific stuff on the material we read in the last few weeks?
Yes.
Great.
Happy to take calls after hours and on weekends too. And the final item here is discussion of items to be placed on the next agenda. Happy to work with the chair on that, unless there are other ideas that we would like to capture.
I think
tonight.
we did mention earlier, and George and I talked about this before too, is to make sure we have substantive. Right word.
Substantive.
Yes, that word. Committee reports, so that this doesn't languish and we get off to a good start, and that the committee should be expected to report some progress from meeting to meeting, even if that is just that we've gotten together, chosen a leader, and put our information requests out.
I'd like to make a request for a specific agenda item for our next meeting. And I think it would be very worthwhile to have Nolan Tam join us for a presentation. To that end, I've actually prepared a request for information that we might hear a response from them. I just think that they're a very major part of this going forward, and that exposure will be really beneficial to us.
We will check their schedule and may need to coordinate with the chair.
The only thing I'd say, George, I think that's a great idea, although they covered a lot of options that aren't on our board anymore, so it'd kind of be a waste of time for them to come in and present something that's not on the approved list of projects.
Agree with that.
And if for example, the real estate subcommittee would like to speak with Janet Tam, I mean, we can coordinate a telephone call and accommodate something like that.
Yeah. Well, I've taken
Right.
a first
The more we can refine the specific requests, the more we can prepare Janet for what you're specifically looking for.
George's suggestion of a actual presentation, though, would be interesting to actually see them on their feet addressing the projects that are in question, rather than handling on a subcommittee. That may be something we want the committee at large to. Is that your point, George? I assume it is. That there are people other than the real estate committee that could.
Well, I think we can all benefit from it, or I wouldn't suggest it.
The other.
You can't see their presentation.
Yeah. There's a lot of unanswered questions. Yeah.
So Nolan Tam is going to make a presentation at the next city council, correct?
We're scheduled for March 10th.
March 10th.
City council.
Yeah.
And
So
then
would it be unreasonable for us to ask some questions if we have some, if we attend the city council and just do it as in the public comment period? Or is that pushing it?
The challenge is we would need to limit the participation to no more than 3 of you, unless we schedule it as a joint city council planning commission meeting. I'm sorry, city council task force meeting. And it's something that if we have this, if we have the chair participate in the council meeting, we can discuss that at the time on the 20, I'm losing track of dates, but the 25th is our next council meeting.
Okay.
So your final action is a motion to adjourn.
So
I have one request first. There are some really good resources on the website, financial reports, and I'm not an accountant. I struggle to read some of this stuff, but I think it would be just like it would be good background to hear the architectural presentation there. I would say the current year budget and 5-year CIP is worth looking at. The comprehensive annual financial report is worth looking at. I would ask that the task force members, if you have time, I think it would be really informative, if you haven't already, to take a look at that stuff. I don't begin to understand it, but it does clarify a few things. You have a motion to adjourn. Second. Second. All those in favor signify their hand. Carried. Adjourned. Thank you.